All right, perfect. Adam, first off, thank you so much for the time. Where are you sitting?
Right now, at a family member's house in New York. Um, we've been spending time here, was we've been sheltering in place. We usually based in New York City, but got out of our smaller apartment to get a little bit more space out in the suburbs.
Can we see the porcelain to prove it?
This is my green tea.
So give us a little overview of your role and sort of what you're doing before and what you're doing now.
Um, at BTG, so I work at BTG, freelance marketplace focused on high-end business talent. Um, my role now, I lead our enterprise business. So we have a specific distinct offering for enterprise clients, and also corporate development. So channel partners, M&A activity, things like that. I support with our CEOs. It's been, I've been in the role in varying capacities the last year or two. And before that, I've spent a lot of time at BTG. 13-year-old company. I've been there almost 10 years. So kind of worn a lot of hats, but started cold calling and booking meetings back in the day as the first entry-level hire here at BTG, and then was a client-facing salesperson, and then worked in corporate development roles and different sales leadership roles before moving over to be chief of staff to our CEO, and now leading enterprise and corp dev. So it's been it's been just been different as you go, different roles, but also 10 years ago, freelance looked a lot different. So it's been a little bit of a wild ride to see the growth, and somewhat validating now, even if, the future of work is now has been the slogan for years. It's validating that there's a heck of a lot more people interested in it. And at least when I explain what my job is to people who aren't in the industry, it takes a lot less time now because people have heard of this.
So you're at BCG basically as long as that porcelain has been in your in-laws shelves.
Along those, something, I don't know. This might predate me, but it's a good mug.
So I'd love to hear both, what does a freelancer look like for you? Like, what's the typical freelancer when you think freelance, along with how has that changed? Because I think that's something very interesting, is 10 years ago to today, what does the freelancer look like and how has it changed?
I think it's worth noting I have a very skewed, I could answer sort of like intellectually overall industry, but where we work with, what I'm mostly used to is at BTG, the folks in our marketplace are really highly skilled folks. They're people who spent years at McKinsey or Accenture or Deloitte and went to the top business schools in the world, and they have a pedigree that it's a narrow segment of the broader freelance world. Within that world, kind of continue to see, it looks a lot like the MBA class of 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. So you start to see, demographically it shifts. It's predominantly male, still is, but was probably more male 10 years ago, because that's what the MBA class had looked 5 to 10 years before that. I would say there are now more people younger in their career who are independent. That wasn't the case. A lot of the folks in the high end business talent category, there are people clearing 6 figures a year as independents. You didn't see as many people, earlier in their career going independent in that segment, because you spent a year or two at Deloitte, you didn't necessarily have the right skills yet to work on your own, or the infrastructure to support it from a BD perspective, from just to being effective. Now there are more people doing that. I also think we're seeing more people with varied backgrounds, still a lot of consultants and people who are trained that way, but people who are just, RPA experts, AI experts. Side topics that weren't prevalent 10 years ago. Even data science or different roles within data translators versus, that role wasn't necessarily prominent 10 years ago, not at scale. Companies weren't looking for that to tap into. So those are some evolutions. There's sort of skills and backgrounds that people have now that are in demand that didn't exist, that people weren't hiring for full-time or through freelance 10 years ago.
Yeah, and and so what does the customer look like in terms of, large company, small company, industry? Yeah, what does a typical customer look like?
Again, a little skewed from our perspective, and I don't know, folks watching may have never heard of us or know me or anything like that. We, from the beginning, focused on serving Fortune 1000 companies. So we didn't start as an SMB, focused on the SMB category and then move into serving enterprise later on, which I think that's a common theme on the freelance platform journey. And our leadership team just took a different approach and decided to go with focusing on enterprise first. So we've only ever served large companies. So even back in the day when I first started and was, cold calling companies and then had a territory, it was some of them were Fortune 100 companies when I was straight out of college. So that's our client base. I mean, we do serve private equity and professional services companies too, but it's always large enterprise-like organizations. And in our world, it makes sense because that's who's using traditional management consulting firms. That's who's using those kinds of skills at scale. That certainly are organizations of a smaller scale that need that talent, but they're not buying in bulk the way that large organizations are engaging traditional firms and that kind of, and even hiring those kinds of skills full time.
Gotcha. And deeper than the customer, who is the freelancer working with? Like, is it a chief product officer, chief marketing officer? Is it a product manager? What is the actual person that a freelancer would work with look like?
Yeah, also varies. Good or bad, our sweet spot's broad, which means that when someone asks the question, it's like, oh, well, it's not an easy answer, but listen, give me a minute. It could be anything from the strategy function, the corp dev function, marketing, operations, supply chain, logistics and distribution. Everything the world's going through with this pandemic, lots going on in supply chain. We've always done work there, but we saw a ton of work that hit, supply chain resiliency. So companies that were going through all this cost cutting and efficiency plays now said, okay, well, we're trying to narrow our network for cost efficiency, but that region of the world is shut down. This country is, we can't access. So now we have to actually focus on a more diverse network so it's more resilient. So we do, operations is big. I said strategy, M&A, finance also. You mentioned product. Not really for us. We do work with GMs and P&L owners of products, but not as, and we are getting more and more into chief product officers with data science and some of the sort of upstream technical aspects, but we don't do any dev. We don't have engineers, so we're not as deep with CIOs and CTOs outside of strategic digital transformation work and maybe implementation on the business side, things like change management and execution, not on the creation of product the way that other marketplaces are really deep in the IT function.
Gotcha. And why do these companies turn to BTG and freelancers? Why don't they just stick with their full-timers, their contractors, their temps, their existing alternatives? Why freelance?
Yeah, that actually, I feel like that might be an interesting, you asked the 10-year arc before on certain things. This is more, when I first joined, it was a lot of, oh shit moments. Like, oh shit, we need to get this done. Oh, this guy's out, that woman's out. We got to fill this space and we don't know how to do it. One of the first really sizable projects that I recall us getting into was when there was a large pharma company that bought another pharma company, and they offered the quote unquote package where people could leave because they knew that they were and too many people took it. And then suddenly you didn't have, you had all these functions that were totally understaffed because people didn't necessarily stick around and you needed to get a lot of work done. It went from that to now, honestly, there's just skills that don't exist in the full-time market, where you can't access because there's more and more people who want to be independent as a choice because what they're going to get paid is maybe higher, or because they want to get involved with a certain phase of the work, but not like they're really good at design. That's their specialty, upfront design. But then if they're in the full-time role, they also have to be masters of execution and people management and change management and all kinds of other things. And it's the same reason a lot of people, not the same reason, but there's parallels to why people leave consulting firms. Because when you stay there, you're selling projects, not doing the work. And you get to the point where you're really good at something and you want to focus there. So you stick with that. And they get that optionality when they're freelance. But I think, you've seen evolution from the sort of oh shit moments to we need these skills that aren't readily available. And now, frankly, it's small. I don't know if it's small, but it's growing. But there are companies now who actually are thinking from a workforce planning perspective. How do we build this in and not think about it as like, okay, we're going to build some capacity and budget and we're going to fill the gaps with freelance, but we're actually going to get this type of work done with freelancers going forward, which means we may choose to staff the teams differently because we may have a core team internally that focuses on 80% of the work that's going to get done, but that other 20%, we're going to bring in people on a project by project basis who have really deep expertise, because if we were to bring them on full time, they wouldn't be operating at the full capacity all the time. They'd be frustrated. We'd be looking at it saying, is this the right decision? And now people are actually thinking about how do we staff an organization? Again, I think, you don't see very many Fortune 1000 companies who are totally shifting, workforce planning, but they're talking about it and trying to figure out how do we get from here to there, so that we can actually, honestly, it's more about it's optimizing for it. Yeah. It's how do we know we could be doing better, but we don't know how to set ourselves up for it.
An overwhelming theme I hear from you in relation to how it relates to the individual freelancer is differentiation. Specifically, it used to be that when you had a bunch of full-time employees, your teams kind of looked the same and they were pretty homogenous. So if you were going to compete against your competitor, you were kind of competing with homogenous product teams. Now, in freelance, you can bring on some crazy hyper-relevant and hyper-skilled people in ways that are non-traditional. And so I may look at one of my examples in building a product at Microsoft. I brought someone in that was a Microsoft expert to teach me how to use the actual tools I was building. That wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't an opportunity to bring outside talent into the building. Also look at a book project where, we had the traditional writers, editors, designers, and researchers. But we actually brought a comedian in. And so you're enabled this creativity and differentiation that is so unique. So I think the insight for the freelancer is don't worry about being different. Like be differentiated. Have your tangible skill that's different and unique and is going to be hyper relevant for some people. So I'd love to hear what are some of the most memorable both projects and individual freelancers you've seen?
So you had me thinking about one, actually, was you were talking about the work at Microsoft, or actually one other thing. What I think when people think about, like you asked before about freelancers replacing full-time, there will be some of that. And I think there's tension and friction there. But the idea that there are people who have institutional knowledge the value is significant there. And bringing in a freelancer, I think you took a unique approach where you were sort of new to Microsoft, so you brought in somebody who knew Microsoft. But there's ways that you can actually leverage that institutional knowledge and bring in freelancers who can maximize it because they have a different skill set, and to actually they couldn't step in on their own and have the same impact. They could come up with some ideas, maybe build a product, but is it ever going to get adopted? Is it ever going to integrate properly with the culture of the organization? But if you pair people accordingly and you think about those aspects of a project, it can be more effective. So just to flip on sort of what you did, I think there's ways that that organizations can be maximizing what they have on staff. But interesting projects, one that has always stuck out, there's a couple. These are kind of original BTG case studies. One that I always thought was cool was there was a retailer, pretty common. I mean, it's a very mainstream retailer who was struggling against some digital streaming services and came to BTG to figure out pretty much a customer engagement strategy. And our team recommended a customer loyalty specialist who actually had built one of the leading frequent flyer programs and had led the frequent flyer program for one of the top 5 US airlines. And that person came in and helped develop a customer engagement strategy. And that company bought them. I mean, listen, they were they were going to lose to digital at some point, potentially. And they bought themselves years because they created a very robust loyalty program that made them the absolute largest, they had the largest market share in a business that was shrinking. And they were able to grow and extend their lifeline because of this customer engagement strategy. But they would never have thought to or been able to engage there was a woman who built one of the top frequent flyer programs. That's just not something that they were thinking about. They wanted somebody who had done this in retail before. Same on the medical device side. There was a time a client came and needed to rebuild. It was actually a diabetes device, and they wanted a packaging expert from med device. And our team sort of flipped it and said, "Why do you want them from med device? You want to, look at different industries." And we actually happened to have a woman who worked in marketing at Chanel and Coach, and paired with a management consultant who worked in med device, because you needed to know med device and some of the regulatory aspects and manufacturing for packaging. But that 2-person team was a really, really dangerous combination. And they ended up and that packaging got adopted. And they ended up going with this whole celebrity endorsement campaign with this new packaging. And it did incredibly well, and the product grew significantly. Those are 2 cool projects. I mean, I mentioned earlier, in this sort of pandemic era or moment, a lot of projects around supply chain resiliency, which I think are really interesting, how quickly. A couple others. One of the top grocery chains in the US did not have an online ordering business as of end of February. And come March, member of their leadership team who became aware of BTG came to us, and we delivered a team of folks who helped them actually launch an e-commerce site and online ordering within 3 weeks. And they continue to work with them to improve it and improve the whole platform. But went from having no online delivery to it's the only way people are buying groceries right now in this moment. You can't do that. How can you hire? Within 3 weeks, how could you possibly hire and launch? But they were able to. Another cool one that there's a company in the sanitary products space that just came to us looking for a team that could help them with a new go-to-market focused on travelers, because it was all products to develop for the home. But how do you start developing, how do you repackage the existing products in a grab and go format? So when some traveler in the airport needs to, get whatever the product is that they sell, but they want a disposable package of it so they can bring it on the airplane, wipe down their seat, clean their space, and then toss it in the garbage and not put that package back in their bag because maybe it, got contaminated so just a totally different approach. And those are things that they had to solve immediately. And, they thought about, okay, well, let's use freelancers here. And all those projects were, some of them are still ongoing, but have been successful, and there's, good feedback. And in all those cases, it was probably people that they would never have found, on their own, whether because they're not local, like geographically they weren't thinking about it, or because they came from other industries or other disciplines that the traditional, you wouldn't think to hire because you would, you work in retail, you want someone from retail. You weren't necessarily thinking about bringing someone in from the airline industry.
Yeah, I love I love the airline industry with the institutional knowledge. It's kind of cheesy, but it's like peanut butter and jelly, right? Where the freelancer or freelancers enable you to be so much better at your job than you would be yourself, whether that's your team or whether that's yourself. And that's like really cool, right? Like it's not saying we're replacing full-time employees, it's the opposite. It's saying we're amplifying and augmenting what you can do, which is so, so cool. So what would you say is one defining trait for a freelancer that everyone listening can carry over into their freelance business?
Yeah, you said one, and my head went to two, but I'll narrow it to one.
You can do two. You can even do three if you want.
No, I mean, the folks they're incredibly good at least in the enterprise world, they usually interact with a lot of people. They're incredibly good at synthesizing inputs and turning it into something. A lot of times internally teams don't, the communication's not always great and people want to take different approaches. And the idea that they can help synthesize and bring together, don't even need to be like differing opinions, but just the idea that different people have them and they may not have shared them in a certain way and they may not have been heard the right way. But freelancers typically do a good job when they're interacting with a team of people, 4 or 5 people, let's say, of listening to those 4 or 5 people and getting input and putting together a work product that reflects different opinions, and they can explain why they chose what they did and what they're working towards. I think that synthesis is powerful. The second is just rigorous prioritization. I mean, freelancers, they have, I don't know, I was going to say luxury. Maybe that it's of being able to focus. This is what I'm working on right now. You can block out some of the noise, and because there are some things, when you're full-time employee, you're balancing many projects at once. As a freelancer, you're probably also balancing many, but the deadlines, I mean, they should be well scoped and when things are due, and being able to rigorously prioritize so that you can deliver on time and go above and beyond what someone expects is critical, especially when I shouldn't say it's when it's your first one, because you want to do that every time. But when you're building a book of business and working with people, the idea that they can trust you and that you're going to deliver and they don't have to be as involved from a, looking over your shoulder or checking in on things that's the difference between comfort and stress when we're working with someone.
I love that sense of, or I take it as enable your client a sense of calm, meaning be the light in the storm that's able to, like you said, synthesize, but just provide clarity. Like it comes down to leadership. What does every good leader do? They provide clarity. And one thing that we've noticed, we both know, is that, and you call it the trust, but it's that ability to start with one project that turns into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where you become the main point of contact. And the coolest thing that I've seen is when you are the freelancer or the person hiring, and you start with one freelancer, but then you say, hey, we need to get this website done. And there might be 10 freelancers underneath, but you have the trust in that person and it's all about the outcome. So, okay, 2 more laser fast questions. You ready?
Okay.
You have no time to think about it.
Okay.
Favorite book? You can do 2, maybe, or 3.
My head went to Bringing Up Bebe, because that's a book about French parenting styles, and we're 5 weeks away from having our first kid, and my wife and I are handing the book back and forth to one another. But growing up, it was always For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway. I was into that book. I brought it on vacation once, and it was the only book I brought, and I read it like 6 times in a week. So it stuck out to me always.
That's incredible. Okay, so everyone gets whatever it's called, Bring to Bebe or whatever that is. Last question. Favorite animal?
Dog.
Fits you perfectly. Adam, thank you so much.